This is Floyd Abrams, and this is Speaking Freely. And we couldn't have picked a better day to have asked Jamil Jaffer to appear before us today and talk to us. Jamil is the head of the Knight Institute at Columbia University, a great First Amendment protector, and identifier in terms of First Amendment issues. And we're especially glad to have him today with us because of news out of Montana yesterday with respect to TikTok. The governor of Montana has signed legislation which would ban TikTok in the state of Montana. It's effective January 1st. And that is certainly the first and maybe even only thing I'd like to talk with you about today, Amir. First, thank you for coming, and I much appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation. Very happy to be here.
You've spoken out before at a time when really very few people were after the congressional hearings with respect to, among others, TikTok. And at that time, you firmly raised First Amendment issues. Let me start, though, for those of our viewers and listeners who may not be too familiar with the technology. If you could tell us first just what TikTok is and what it offers to the 150 million Americans who participate in it.
Yeah, sure. Well, so TikTok is an app. You can post videos on it, short videos on it. You can watch short videos on it. TikTok elevates videos for its users in the same way that other social media platforms elevate content for their users. So there's an algorithm that decides, what you see. And it's based in part on what you have liked in the past. And TikTok evaluates what you've liked in the past by, among other things, tracking how long you watch particular videos. And, your feed reflects TikTok's judgment about what you like. And it turns out that TikTok's judgment is pretty good, at least in the sense that it keeps people on the platform. But in some ways, TikTok is, very similar to other social media platforms. The content consists of videos rather than, tweets or posts as in on Facebook, but it's a way of sharing speech, of posting it and consuming it.
Now, the stated objection, the stated concern that members of Congress had voiced during the hearings, and that the governor of Montana yesterday, in signing the legislation, referred to, was that the ultimate owner of TikTok is China, or as frequently phrased, the Chinese Communist Party. First question, is that, by its nature, problematic, something that Congress or Montana or others, can have genuine concern about?
Yeah, well, I think it is actually a little more complicated than, TikTok belongs to China. TikTok itself is a U.S. corporation. It's owned by a foreign corporation. My understanding is the foreign corporation is actually incorporated outside of China. It's ByteDance is the corporation, and ByteDance's investors include many American private equity funds. But at the very least, ByteDance has close ties to China. It is subject to Chinese law, at least to some extent. There's a government official, a Chinese government official, who I understand is on ByteDance's board. I think all of that is reason for concern. I also actually think that my argument here is not that TikTok doesn't present the kinds of risks that Montana's governor and others have identified. I do think that TikTok collects a ton of information about its users. I also think that TikTok, like other social media platforms, could be used as a platform to spread disinformation. I not just accept all of that. I think that people should, take all of that stuff really seriously. My objection is to the means that Montana has adopted of addressing that threat. And I'm sure you were going to get there anyway, Floyd. But the First Amendment cares a lot about the means. It's not enough to point to a real problem. The mechanism you use to address the problem has to meet, has to survive constitutional scrutiny. And I don't think that these kinds of bans can survive that scrutiny.
Well, what's the First Amendment problem? I mean, obviously, anytime the government steps in and limits the display or discussion of one sort or another, there's an inherent First Amendment issue. But what is the particular First Amendment problem raised by a statute which essentially bans TikTok entirely from a state, or, if Congress were ever to act, a country?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that there are multiple issues here. So one relates to TikTok's own rights. And I think this is a complicated question if you accept that TikTok is so closely associated with the Chinese government. TikTok, if you think of TikTok as effectively a foreign corporation, then maybe there are difficult questions about whether TikTok has First Amendment rights, what extent, what scope those rights have. But let's set all of that to the side. Whatever TikTok's rights are, TikTok's users have First Amendment rights. It's American users, as you said, 150 million or something approaching 150 million Americans use this platform as a way to share content, share speech, again, videos, but I don't think there's any dispute that the videos are speech within the meaning of the First Amendment, and to consume speech, to watch other people's videos. And TikTok is a kind of community where, it's not just that you are sharing videos and consuming videos, you're doing it as part of this community, this global community. And I think any restriction on those rights has to survive some degree of First Amendment scrutiny. We can have a conversation about what degree, but in the same way, I don't want to draw too close an analogy here because there are obvious differences, but there are obviously similarities as well. In the same way as if the government said, the Guardian is collecting a lot of information about what Americans are reading on the Guardian's platform or the BBC. And for that reason, we're going to, shut down Americans' access to the Guardian or the BBC. I think the government should have to justify it. And I think the same is true, the same is exactly true here. I don't want to say, I keep jumping ahead, Floyd, but I don't want to suggest that, there's a categorical rule here that there are no circumstances in which the government could justify denying Americans access to a foreign technology platform. But I do think the government should have to offer good reasons for it. And it should have to explain not just that the risks are real, but that the mechanism it has adopted to address those risks would, in fact, address those risks and wouldn't unnecessarily curtail free speech rights. And those are the burdens I don't think the government can carry in this context.
I mean, various senators, generally on the right, but have spoken out and had spoken out very strongly in the past about this. Senator Hawley had referred to this as a Trojan horse for the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, what's your sense about an argument in court, let's say, as broad as saying the ultimate owner, the ultimate people who run or can run TikTok and make whatever decisions they want are adversaries of the United States? So why should we allow them to pollute the airwaves, so to speak, for the purpose of persuading and adversely influencing Americans?
Yeah. Well, I have many things to say in response to that question. So let me start with where I probably should have started this whole conversation, even before we get to the First Amendment issues. What the government is proposing to do, the federal government is proposing to do, and Montana has now done, is ban Americans' access to speech from abroad. In this particular case, it's a technology platform, but you can think of it as media more generally. This is a practice, banning citizens' access to foreign media, that we have until now, I think, fairly associated with authoritarian and other rights abusing regimes. Right? This is a hallmark of authoritarianism. It's not an accident that the governments most associated with this practice, include those of Iran and Saudi Arabia and China. Authoritarian regimes use this practice all the time to hold on to power. They deprive their citizens of access to the tools they need to inform themselves and to build solidarity with people from abroad. Now, I'm not saying that that's what's going on here, that this is equivalent to what the Chinese government does or what the Iranian government does. But I do think that we should be very wary of giving our government these kinds of powers, because these powers, we've seen how they're abused in the past. Just a few days ago, we saw the Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan pressure TikTok to take down content in the days before an election. So this is a practice that I think we should be very careful about giving our government the power to adopt. Again, I'm not making the argument we should have a categorical rule. I'm just saying we should go into this with a degree of skepticism. Now, as to your specific question about the disinformation from our enemies, this is a question. This is not an entirely new question. It's a question that came up before the Supreme Court in this case called, which you know well, Floyd, Lamont versus Postmaster General. It's a 1965 case, I believe, involving a federal rule that required people to register with the post office if they wanted to receive communist propaganda from abroad. And the government said, look, we're not banning access. We're not banning anyone's access to this communist propaganda, but we want you to just, give your name to the post office if you want to read it. And the Supreme Court struck down this rule, saying that, if the government is going to burden Americans' access to information from abroad, and that information includes information that the government characterizes as foreign propaganda, communist propaganda in that case, the government has to provide a very good reason for it. And it hasn't provided a good reason for it here. And I think it's not surprising that the court reached that conclusion, because this is really a core principle of every open society, and maybe especially our society. Citizens get to decide for themselves which ideas are worth listening to, which speech they should pay attention to, which ideas are convincing. And that's true even if the government thinks of the speech as foreign propaganda. And maybe it's especially true if the government characterizes the speech as foreign propaganda, that citizens have access to that speech and be able to decide for themselves. That doesn't mean the government has no tools to fight foreign propaganda. The government can tell Americans that if it believes TikTok's algorithm has been hijacked for disinformation purposes, the government can tell Americans that. Maybe it can impose registration requirements. Maybe it can impose other transparency obligations on TikTok. But banning Americans from accessing a platform because the government says this platform is foreign propaganda, I think would be totally inconsistent with our own values and totally inconsistent with that case.
And I agree with you. Let me read to you what the governor of Montana said as a part of his justification for the statute. He said the Communist Party using TikTok to spy on Americans violates their privacy and collects their personal, private, and sensitive information is well documented. mean, for the moment at least, that's the justification, that it's an intrusion into the privacy
Mhm.
of Americans. Uh, what's your response to that as a basis for banning it?
Well, I agree that TikTok collects, huge volumes of information about Americans and others. So do other social media platforms. I think that somebody who is really serious about addressing this problem and the disinformation problem has many policy options that wouldn't require banning Americans' access to the platform. One of them would just be privacy regulation. Just restrict what platforms can collect about Americans. Another possibility is data localization mandates require that TikTok hold Americans' data in the United States where the Chinese government can't access it. Transparency mandates that give Americans more visibility into what the algorithm is doing. Like, these are all policy options that would address or at least mitigate the concerns that the government is pointing to. And they wouldn't require banning Americans from accessing a platform that many Americans see value in.
Well, here we are. Do you expect litigation about this?
I guess I would be shocked if there weren't litigation about it. In fact, I assume that we'll see a lawsuit from at least TikTok or an industry association. Maybe today. And I also think that I think that they have a relatively straightforward case. Um, Again, you have to think about the kind of fit between the government's response and the risks. And I've already mentioned that there are other options, but it's not just that there are other options. I also think that this ban is probably going to be ineffective with respect to at least the privacy issue, because a lot of the information that TikTok collects, very similar information, is available for sale from American data brokers. So if you're the Chinese government and what you really want to achieve here is collecting granular information about Americans' online activities, there are other ways to do it. And banning, TikTok doesn't shut off those other ways. If you want to address those other ways, you need privacy regulation. And with respect to, I think the same is true on the disinformation side. We've already seen that foreign governments don't need to own a social media platform in order to run a disinformation campaign on that platform, right? We saw Russia in the days ahead of the 2016 election run a disinformation campaign on Facebook. And Russia doesn't own Facebook, and yet they were able to do that. And I assume that the Chinese government has at least the ability that Russia does to run those kinds of disinformation campaigns. So it's not just that I think a ban isn't the best option. I think it would be counterproductive, and counterproductive in another sense too, which is authoritarians all over the world would point to this to justify their own censorship. In the same way as when Trump attacked media organizations as fake news, within minutes, authoritarians around the world picked up that language. They saw how useful that language was, and they started using it to justify their treatment of journalists in their own countries. I think we'd see exactly the same thing here.
Would you expect that American civil liberties oriented organizations would themselves commence litigation, the ACLU, or indeed your own organization? Are those sorts of challenges likely, do you think?
I think that they are certainly possible. TikTok users, I think, would have standing to challenge this ban in Montana. And in some ways, I think TikTok users are better positioned to make the important arguments here, because what matters at the end of the day, at least to me, is not TikTok's right to operate a social media platform, let alone the Chinese government's right to own a company that, or partly own a company that operates a social media platform. The important rights, from my perspective, are the rights of users. And it would be nice if the case that were eventually presented to the courts at least included the voices of users. That said, my own organization has no imminent plan to challenge this law.
Final question. Are you surprised by this? By this, I mean not Montana as such, but, a state or our federal government stepping in and taking such a certainly strong sounding step for the interests that they claim are challenged here.
Am I surprised? I'm certainly not surprised that Montana has gone down this road. I mean, just given, in some ways, it's surprising that it's taken this long. And Texas and Florida have been very enthusiastic about enacting legislation that is, in my view, obviously unconstitutional. And I think even they must know that some of the legislation they're enacting is not going to survive constitutional review, but they're engaged in a larger project. These lawsuits are part of the culture war with respect to TikTok. I think this is part of a larger rhetorical battle with China, so in some ways I'm surprised it's taken so long. But I think it's a mistake too. I'm a little bit disappointed to see some of the news stories this morning taking so seriously Montana's national security arguments. I think that this law has the same relationship to national security as Four Seasons Total Landscaping does to the Four Seasons hotel chain. I mean, this just has no connection to national security. If you really wanted to protect national security, you would enact privacy regulations. You would enact transparency mandates. You would enact a data localization mandate. Maybe you would protect journalists and researchers who study the social media platforms. You certainly wouldn't cut off the ability of American researchers to study TikTok, which is one implication of this law or one result of this law. So I just don't think this is a serious effort to protect national security, and I would prefer that journalists not treated as such.
Thank you, Jamel. It's terrific that you're on. I much appreciate your time. You can go back now and answer the phone or whatever as other people take up your day. But thank you very much.
Talk with you, Floyd. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Sure.